Under the blazing Georgia sun, an 11-year-old boy stood frozen as a colonel, a living legend, saluted him in front of hundreds of stunned soldiers. Gasps ripped through the crowd. A once smirking officer paled, realizing too late he was about to face public ruin. But what happened next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. The air at Fort Andrews, moments before light and buzzing with excitement, now hung thick and brittle as glass. Every creak of a folding chair, every clink of a distant flagpole seemed suddenly deafening. Jake stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs, the oversized cap slipping slightly over his brow as he lowered his head. His mind struggled to process the sting. The officer's words hadn't just mocked him. They had spat on the very image of his father he clung to with every fiber of his young being. The eyes of nearby families shifted uncomfortably. A few mothers pursed their lips, exchanging glances of pity and disbelief, but none dared step forward. Fathers crossed their arms, their postures stiffening with a tension they didn't voice. An invisible line had been crossed, but the weight of hierarchy kept mouths clamped shut. In the Army, rank was a wall, and Kyle Reynolds wore his like armor. Jake's chest ached. He stared down at his sneakers, noticing how the laces had come undone, a stupid little detail that somehow made the humiliation sharper. Every fiber of him wanted to defend his father, to shout that Sergeant Morrison wasn't just a hero, he was his hero. The man who taught him to pitch a baseball, who read him stories about ancient warriors, who called him soldier, with a smile that made Jake stand a little taller every time. But the words wouldn't come. His throat tightened into a knot of hurt and rage. If he cried, it would only make it worse. He knew that much. The world blurred around the edges as he blinked back hot tears, forcing himself to stay rooted in place. Lieutenant Reynolds, oblivious or uncaring, turned away with a smug chuckle, slapping another officer on the back as if he'd told a great joke. The younger men around him laughed nervously, the kind of brittle laughter that revealed more fear than joy. None of them wanted to be the next target. In Kyle's world, power meant belittling those who couldn't fight back, and today that meant an 11-year-old boy left holding a cap too big for his head and a silence too heavy for his heart. Beyond the courtyard, the American flag whipped in the wind, its fabric snapping sharply in the gathering stillness. Somewhere deep inside Jake, beneath the hurt and the humiliation, something hardened. A quiet, simmering pride that refused to be extinguished, no matter how deep the shame cut. The wooden slats of the picnic bench bit into Jake's legs as he sat rigid, his small frame hunched over in a way that made him seem even smaller. His fists, white-knuckled, clutched the frayed brim of his father's cap, twisting it unconsciously in his lap. Around him, the joyful noise that had once filled the base grounds sputtered and faded, replaced by a tense, uneasy hum, as if the very air disapproved but didn't know how to speak. The smell of grilled hamburgers, once inviting, now clung to his throat like ash. Jake's chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. He stared ahead blankly, seeing but not seeing the rows of banners, the smiling faces frozen in their forced merriment. His mind clung to memories stronger than the ache blooming in his heart, memories of Sergeant Morrison kneeling beside his bed, assuring him that monsters could never win as long as brave men stood against them. Memories of his father's calloused hands helping him build a model fighter jet, laughing when Jake glued the wings on backward. Memories of a man who wore duty and honor like a second skin, a man who deserved more than the snide dismissal of some careless lieutenant. Kyle Reynolds, for his part, drifted among the crowd with the ease of someone blind to the wreckage he left behind. He smiled broadly, shook hands with important-looking guests, tossing quick, sanitized compliments at the higher-ups while ignoring the stiffened backs and narrowed eyes of the enlisted families. His uniform was immaculate, medals gleaming sharply in the sunlight, symbols of achievement polished more for appearance than for meaning. Kyle wasn't a monster, not exactly. He was worse. A man who had forgotten the soul beneath the uniform, the blood behind the medals. Jake didn't have words for it yet, but what rooted itself inside him wasn't just sadness. It was something hotter, heavier. A molten coil of anger winding slowly through his chest. A hatred, not born of violence, but of betrayal. The betrayal of what he had been taught to believe in. If officers like Kyle could mock a boy's pride in his father's sacrifice, what did that say about the world Jake was growing into? Around the courtyard, others felt it too. Small ripples of resentment passed silently from father to father, mother to mother. It was in the tight-lipped grimaces, the long, accusing stares cast at Lieutenant Reynolds when his back was turned. It was in the way conversations dropped to murmurs whenever Kyle passed by, in the way some fathers placed a steadying hand on their sons' shoulders, as if to ground them against a wrong too big to name. Jake remained silent on the bench, but his silence was no longer one of defeat. It was the heavy, gathering silence before a storm. The black SUV's tires crackled against the gravel as it pulled into the heart of Fort Andrews, its tinted windows swallowing the harsh midday glare. Conversations faltered, thinning into wary glances as the vehicle rolled to a stop near the flagpole, its engine idling with a low, throaty growl. Even from a distance, everyone recognized the plates. Not a visiting politician, not a bureaucrat from base administration, but someone who mattered in a way few dared to speak lightly about. Colonel Stephen Harrington stepped out, the door closing behind him with a muted, decisive thud. The colonel cut an imposing figure, not because of his height or the rigid set of his jaw, but because of something deeper, a gravity that seemed to ripple outward, demanding attention without a single spoken word. His dress uniform bore the marks of a life spent where bullets flew and men cried out, ribbons that spoke of valor, hardship, and scars invisible to civilians. Jake watched from the bench, his small fingers still clutching the battered cap. He barely dared to lift his head, but something about the colonel's presence forced the boy's gaze upward, as if drawn by an invisible force. Colonel Harrington scanned the crowd with eyes sharp as steel, eyes trained to see what others missed, the shifts in posture, the way smiles were strained and laughter came too brittle. It took him seconds to notice the anomaly in the celebration. A boy, isolated and bruised in spirit, ignored amid a sea of forced cheer. The colonel's boots thudded against the concrete as he moved forward, measured, deliberate. Those he passed straightened instinctively, hands twitching toward salutes they caught themselves suppressing at the last second. Harrington paused beside a lower-ranking sergeant stationed near the refreshment tents, a man who swallowed hard before answering the colonel's low-voiced inquiry. Whatever was said, whatever brief explanation passed between them, made the colonel's face darken visibly. His jaw clenched, the muscles along his temple twitching in a silent snarl of controlled fury. He said nothing in return, only turned on his heel with renewed purpose, scanning the crowd until his gaze locked onto Kyle Reynolds. Lieutenant Reynolds, oblivious to the gathering storm, was still basking in his self-importance, sharing exaggerated stories with a pair of junior officers who laughed a little too quickly, a little too loudly. He didn't see Harrington approaching. He didn't notice how the air around him had cooled, how the courtyard itself seemed to hold its breath. But Jake noticed. Jake felt the shift in the atmosphere, heavy and electric. He pressed the army cap tighter against his chest, his heart thudding against it like a drumbeat heralding something he didn't fully understand, but instinctively knew he needed to witness. Colonel Harrington was not a man given to loud scenes or wasted words. When he acted, the world around him changed, and he was moving now, straight toward the place where honor had been insulted and where justice demanded to be served. The moment Colonel Harrington reached the open courtyard, time itself seemed to lurch and stagger, as if recognizing that something irreversible was about to unfold. Conversations died mid-sentence. Paper cups, half crushed in distracted hands, hung suspended as all eyes shifted to the figure striding with unmistakable purpose toward the oblivious Lieutenant Reynolds. Kyle caught the shift too late. His laughter, hollow and forced, choked off in his throat when he turned and found himself face to face with the colonel's glacial stare. The blood drained from his face, his easygoing swagger crumbling into a rigid, instinctive salute, his spine snapping straight as if yanked by an invisible wire. But Harrington didn't return the salute. He didn't even glance at Reynolds. Instead, without a word, Colonel Stephen Harrington pivoted sharply and marched past him, directly toward the small boy sitting alone at the edge of the gathering, clutching a tattered army cap like a shield against the world. Jake blinked up at the towering man, confused, his small body stiff with the effort of not shrinking back. His lips parted slightly, but no words came. The weight of all the watching eyes pinned him in place, along with the unbearable fear that somehow, impossibly, he was about to be reprimanded further. But Harrington's face, stern as chiseled stone, softened, just barely. And then, in a movement so deliberate and precise that it might have echoed across the parade ground, the colonel snapped his heels together, raised his hand, and delivered a flawless, crisp salute. Not to a general, not to a politician, to an 11-year-old boy. Gasps rippled through the crowd like the breaking of a great dam. Officers and enlisted men alike stiffened in shock. Mothers pressed their hands over their hearts. Fathers who had been soldiers themselves straightened in silent respect, blinking back a stinging moisture they would not dare name. Jake, stunned, hesitated before shakily rising to his feet, his small hand fumbling upwards into the rough semblance of a salute, mirroring the posture his father had taught him in their living room years ago. The cap tumbled to the ground as he moved, but he didn't notice. All that existed in that moment was the bond, silent, indestructible, between the boy who believed in honor and the man who embodied it. Colonel Harrington's voice, when it finally broke the stunned silence, was low but carried with the unshakable force of authority. "Son," he said, his words slicing through the heavy air, "I salute not just your father's service. I salute the strength you show standing here today. Never let anyone make you doubt who you come from." A slow, rumbling applause built from the edges of the crowd, gathering force until it rolled across the field in a tidal wave of roaring approval. The noise struck Kyle Reynolds like a physical blow. His mouth opened, shut, then opened again, but no defense could rise to meet the tidal shift against him. He had not merely mocked a boy, he had spat on the very spirit the entire base was built to honor. And now, under the gaze of every soldier, every family member, every beating heart in the courtyard, Kyle Reynolds stood stripped of his armor of arrogance, a hollow man exposed before an unforgiving tribunal of silent judgment. Colonel Harrington let his salute fall only after Jake's trembling hand dropped, the boy blinking rapidly as if trying to etch the moment into the marrow of his bones. The applause still thundered through the courtyard, but the colonel's attention had already shifted, now sharp, now cold, as he turned with mechanical precision to face Lieutenant Kyle Reynolds. The lieutenant, sensing the inevitable, snapped into a stiff, awkward attention, his fingers twitching by his side. His mind raced to cobble together an excuse, some way to explain away the casual cruelty he had unleashed on a child. But in the face of Colonel Harrington's icy stare, every lie turned to ash on his tongue. Harrington advanced with the slow, unrelenting pace of a man who knew exactly the weight of the authority he carried. He stopped just short of Kyle, his voice low, perfectly controlled, and far more lethal than if he had shouted. "Lieutenant Reynolds," he said, each syllable polished to a scalpel's edge. "You will step forward. Now." Kyle moved, his steps stiff and mechanical, like a puppet dragged unwillingly toward judgment. The murmurs from the crowd swelled again, thick with scorn, anger, and something dangerously close to anticipation. Harrington's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It wrapped around every man, woman, and child gathered there, binding them into unwilling witnesses. "You mocked the son of a deployed soldier," Harrington said, his words slicing into the silence. "You ridiculed the honor of a man serving this nation while you prance around this base preening like a peacock at a garden party." Reynolds flinched, sweat beginning to bead along his temple despite the cool breeze. His mouth opened in a silent gasp, but no defense dared emerge. "You will apologize," Harrington continued, his tone absolute, "to this boy, to his father, and to every man and woman you disgraced with your arrogance today. And you will do it properly, here and now, before every eye you insulted with your cowardice." A strangled sound escaped Kyle's throat, half plea, half protest. But Harrington's eyes narrowed just slightly, and the lieutenant crumbled. Slowly, awkwardly, he turned to face Jake, who stood still as a statue, cap clutched once more against his chest. Kyle sank to one knee, the gravel grinding under his weight, his head bowed low in abject shame. His voice, when it came, was barely louder than a whisper, cracked, hollow, and stripped of all the smugness that had once dripped from it. "I'm sorry," he rasped, "for what I said about your father. I was wrong, and I'm sorry for disrespecting you, your family, and everyone here." It wasn't enough. The words were weak, crumbling as they fell from his lips, but the sight of the proud officer reduced to a pleading shadow was enough for the audience. The murmur of approval rose again, sharper, more satisfied. Fathers nodded grimly. Mothers squeezed their children's shoulders. Jake said nothing. He only nodded once, small, solemn, powerful beyond his years. He didn't need to gloat. His silence was the loudest answer of all. Colonel Harrington allowed the moment to stretch a heartbeat longer, letting the weight of it burn itself into every witness's memory. Then he leaned in close to Kyle's bowed form and spoke so only he could hear, but the intensity was unmistakable. "Character is what you do when you think no one's watching," he said. "Today, everyone saw exactly who you are." Kyle flinched as if struck. Harrington straightened, gave Jake a final nod of deep respect, and turned crisply on his heel, his presence leaving a vacuum of stunned awe behind him. Justice had been served, not with fists or fury, but with a dignity and finality that would ripple through Fort Andrews for a long, long time.